trying to figure out how Putin can exit this war. The President of the United States made headlines the other day by just casually mentioning Armageddon as a possible outcome of the rapidly escalating war in Ukraine. We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Biden said, adding the false claim that Vladimir Putin talks about potential use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological or chemical weapons in this conflict. First time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have the threat of a nuclear weapon if in fact things continue to go down the path they are going, the president said in the same speech. We are trying to figure out what is Putin's off-ramp. Where does he find a way out? Where does he find himself where he does not only lose face but significant power? As though the U.S. government itself has not played a major role in both provoking and sustaining this conflict. These are questions that Biden should ask himself, World Socialist website's David North writes of Biden's musings. Having instigated the U.S.-NATO proxy war, provided Ukraine with unlimited weapons and money, pledged the reconquest of Crimea, and called for regime change in Russia, what is Biden's off-ramp? How can he de-escalate where he does not only lose face but significant power? Indeed, it is simply a well-documented fact that the U.S. has been aggressively pushing toward this conflict since it backed a coup in Ukraine in 2014, and really since 2008, when NATO membership for Ukraine was placed on the table and continually promoted by the United States right up until shortly before Russia's February invasion. Which is why all the way back in 2015, John Mearsheimer was explicitly warning that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path, and the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. There's also an abundance of evidence that the Western Empire actively sabotaged a peace deal between Moscow and Kyiv in the early days of the war, which would have given Putin precisely the off-ramp which Biden feigns concern about with Bambi-eyed innocence. It's also entirely self-evident that the only reason this war is even happening is because the U.S. and its allies are pouring tens of billions of dollars worth of weaponry into this conflict, which are being used by CIA-trained fighters who are aided by U.S. intelligence and by an alarming number of U.S. special operations and intelligence forces with boots on the ground in Ukraine. So when Biden says, we are trying to figure out what is Putin's off-ramp, one is easily reminded of the "we're all trying to find the guy who did this" hot dog sketch from the I Think You Should Leave sketch comedy show. Empire apologists always pretend this is just a war between Russia and Ukraine, like there isn't a gigantic globe-spanning third party who's been actively stoking this conflict for many years and has moved mountains to keep this war going. We see it every day, like just recently when Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin was asking for ideas on how this war can end. The way out of the conflict is for Russia to leave Ukraine, Marin said. Actor Mark Ruffalo shared Marin's comments on Twitter saying, "It's so simple. Russia, leave Ukraine and it's over. World peace. Ukraine can't leave Ukraine. Russia can always go back to Russia." This is a constant throughout mainstream discourse about this war. This is solely a conflict between the righteous defender Ukraine and the evil invader Russia, and exactly zero other world powers at all. Russia is the sole aggressor involved in this war, so all Russia needs to do is stop aggressing and it will end. Pay no attention to the mountains of aggression the U.S. and its client states have poured into sparking and sustaining this war. Pay no attention to that empire behind the curtain. So simple, Ruffalo says. If the mainstream political class always talks about a major world event without ever mentioning the empire-sized elephant in the room, there's a good chance we are being propagandized by that empire.
That more or less clarifies the position that some of us have. We may not all have that same exact position, but it does show the fact that there's an empire going on here, which the more we can ignore it, the better it is for the empire. And it's been going on most of my life, and I know I've become acutely aware of the role it's playing in the world, and probably has caused more chaos and destruction in the world than any other force. And we have to address it. I mean, yes, there's other empires through history, but the one that's doing it right now is the U.S. empire. It's powerful. So that's why we're here to talk about it. We hope we can understand and learn more about what people think of the role it's playing, how it can be changed. We're going to learn from 4 panelists here today about their groups, about their activism. We're going to learn about their ideas about how to define some of these terms that we keep hearing. Colonialism, empire, and on, democracy. And then the third question will be, how can we work together and expand the anti-imperialist coalition? So we're going to bring our guests up one at a time, but first I want to mention that this is our third panel. So the first panel we had, General Baker Institute had a representative, the Yemen Liberation Group, the CPUSA, the LRNA, LRNA, League of Revolutionary for New America, and WILPF, Women's International League. And then in the second panel we had, the last one, we had representatives from the Green Party, from Peace Action, from the YCL, Young Communist League, and PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation. So the idea here is to expand and include as many people who want to be part of it. Every time we've done this, it's gotten bigger and more important for the movement. And we appreciate the groups who are willing to join us today. We're going to probably have one more of these panels about Unite Against Imperialists, because we didn't get everybody up here on this one. We have, for the next one, we still want to get Abayomi Askiwi up here, a great spokesman that knows all about imperialism, and a representative from Veterans for Peace. Any other groups that you have in mind that you think want to be part of this and would like to speak, please let us know. We today, unfortunately, one of our guests, who is Sahar Faraj from the Palestine Youth Movement, and I know many of us have worked in solidarity with Palestinians, she won't be able to appear today, but that's all right. We got someone to replace her, and a very adequate, a very substantial person who we've known for many years, and I think we'll bring him up first. He's been with many groups, and I'm going to let him talk about that when he gets up there, but his name is David Soul. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Soul to the stage here. All right, so next is our guest from a group called Movimiento, Cosecha, Paula Astudillo. Let's welcome Paula up to the panel. Now, I want to just say a little aside here for Paula. You can sit here. Paula is the wife of Vicente, who is the son of Ishmael Duran, who many of us know Ishmael Duran, the wonderful Chilean activist who passed away recently, and we love him and his family, and she's here to talk about her group and what she's doing. Now we have 2 other activists that are going to join us who are not representing any specific group, although they've been with many. So we decided to expand this beyond just groups. You can just be an activist here who's been in the struggle, and you're still with groups, so you can mention that when you talk. One of them is Sammie Lewis, and we'd like to welcome Sammie Lewis to the panel. Sammie's been in a couple of our last panel discussions during the Q&A. She's so eloquent that we wanted her to be part of this. We know her activism. So we'll find more about it in a minute. And to conclude the panel today, we also have a person I've known probably 50 years or more, I know, and most of you know him too. He's the most outspoken, loud-voiced, determined revolutionary in this city. His name is Jerry Goldberg. All right, so just to set the groundwork here, I'm going to ask the first question. I'm going to have each panelist speak on that for about 5 minutes at the most each. And then we're going to have you ask questions, if you have any, at that point. And we have our good friend here, Pat, who has the microphone for the audience. So if you want to say a question, not a comment, a question to the 4 panelists after they answer each question, then he'll take the mic to you and you can speak. All right, so we have 3 questions. The first one's going to be, like I mentioned, about describe your group. Second one's going to be define terminology. The third one's where do we go from here? So I think we don't have a hat to pick a name out of, so we'll just start at this end and go that way, okay? For this first question, then next one we'll go that way, whatever. So the first question is to describe your group and other groups that you work with and what their role is in regards to imperialism. So we're going to let David speak first.
So, Communist Workers' League resulted from a breakup, especially in the leadership of the Workers' World Party 2018, and resulted in several organizations, and the Communist Workers' League is a Marxist formation scattered in different states in the USA that is an anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, Marxist organization. But we work within many other coalitions, united fronts, and various groups that form or reform to advance the programs that we believe in. Some of us go back to the 60s, as was said before, got our feet on the ground around Vietnam protests, and some of us even to the civil rights movement in the early 60s. The question of imperialism is critical. Some people think maybe you could just fight for higher wages, health care, an end to student debt, things like that, domestic issues, which seem to be easier to agree upon. But in the end, everything comes round and depends on having a view of the world that fully explains that the U.S. doesn't just send us to war to die and kill in wars abroad for no reason. They send us into these wars over generations to enhance the profits of Wall Street, the banks and corporations. We call it monopoly capitalism, and it's really not different than domestic capitalism. It's just its international face. So you can't separate imperialism from the struggle right here at home on its many fronts. And critical to understand that, because if you're fighting, say, against pension theft back in the early 2010s here in Detroit, where they declared false bankruptcy and went after, they wanted to take pensions, they took pensions, a lot of pensions away from 30,000 city retirees. We had to expose, in fighting that, of course all the retirees opposed it, but we had to expose that it was the banks behind it and that the banks paid nothing in that bankruptcy. The workers and the retirees paid 80% of the debt that was canceled. 80% came from retirees, their pensions. And so we're targeting the same banks and corporations, perhaps, that are looting other countries, that are targeting socialist countries around the world. So it's and the issue constantly facing us here in Detroit and in other parts of the USA is police brutality and police terrorism. But this is only a domestic occupation force against oppressed peoples right here in the US. And it stems from capitalism. And capitalism especially needs racism, because think about it. Years ago there was a movement, Occupy Wall Street, and they talked about we are the 99%. Should have been 99.99% numerically. But the point being that we ought to be able to overturn this government and this economic system and use this huge wealth of this country for people, except we're not united. And what keeps us divided? Well, the ruling class, use that terminology, the rulers, the real powers in this country have perfected and constantly generating racism, oppression against immigrants, against Arab people, against women, against LGBTQ plus people. It's a masterful approach to divide and conquer. And so instead of being the vast majority, the 99.99% in action, we see constantly people fighting each other. And Trump was a master of that and has gathered around him, not people who are necessarily just wealthy. There are a lot of poor people white people who got around Trump and are still around Trump. But He's gathered them together under a banner of racism. And whereas if you think about it logically, they should be part of the mass movement for health care, free education, free health care, good housing, water, but that's not there because they're so consumed with this race hatred. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Let's give David a round of applause. Get the board doing. Yeah. Thanks for starting it off, Dave. You hit exactly 5 minutes. That was perfect. Okay, cool. All right, so I did want to mention that we're all inclusive, or a coalition. We work with communists, we work with socialists, we work with anarchists. There's no problem with that. This is what this group is. We have to work together with all people. We work with Peace Action, which is a social democratic, more or less sort of group, and Veterans for Peace, and anybody who wants to work against U.S. imperialism, please join us and work with each other, regardless of what parties we belong to. That's the most important thing there. And secondly, I did want to mention these panel discussions are filmed, and they'll be on our YouTube channel, Michigan Peace Council YouTube channel. So the first 2 panels are available there. And now I'm excited to introduce once again Paula Astudillo.
First, thank you for the invitation. Probably I'm not the best speaker on this topic, and also from the immigration approach, but I'm an immigrant myself, and since I moved here to Detroit, Michigan, I joined Movimiento Cosecha, which means harvest movement, and is an organization led by undocumented immigrants. And that's the first thing that was the big highlight for me. Because in my own experience in my home country, Chile, South America, the NGO industry has been damaging, actually, in my view, which is the revolutionary and political and social movement of the peoples. And I see that here too, in different sectors and struggle areas, but incredibly strong in the immigrant struggle. So I joined Movimiento Cosecha because really that's kind of at the basis of the movement. It's led by undocumented immigrants. We are a grassroots organization that we are right now in different states. In Michigan, we are in Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, Ypsi, Holland, Detroit, Kalamazoo. We participate in circles and we have weekly, bi-weekly meetings. Our main purpose is to fight for permanent protection, respect and dignity. And we like to say it that way because for us it means more than the papers. It means more than a path to citizenship and immigration reform, which is important and is kind of our tactic victory. But when we say respect and dignity, even if we get the papers, we are still the working class. We are still going to suffer racism, patriarchism, colonialism, exploitation, oppression, as any other working class. So that's why we say also respect and dignity, to live, as human beings with the human rights we deserve, and with the right to move wherever we want for the well-being of ourselves, our families, our communities. One of our core strategies to build a movement is what we call educación popular y poder popular, which has a strong tradition in Latin America. By the way, Movimiento Cosecha is mostly a Latin American movement. We want the unity of all immigrants, But because of the history of the movement, we started with DACA organizers in 2015. Basically, we do all our meetings in Spanish, so probably I'm gonna struggle with some terms here, but there are some cameras that can help me. Well, we base our organization in popular education, political popular education. Paulo Freire, a Brazilian political leader and very important for the social movements in Latin America, is kind of a keystone for us. And we believe in poder popular, popular power that doesn't translate very well. It keeps away a little bit of the political meaning that it has, but those two are kind of our keystones. And so we cannot understand migration without imperialism, right? I mean, migration has been deeply influenced, shaped since colonialism, actually. So basically, we as immigrants are permanent products, if you want to, of imperialism. And so we cannot understand one without the other. And yeah. Yeah, I can keep.
Paula, Astudillo. Now we'll move on to our next panelist, who also was part of our last panel in a sense, because she spoke very well in the Q&A section, and now she's going to tell you, even though she's not here representing any one singular group, she's going to tell us all about her life, whatever she wants to say.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Sammie Lewis. I had previously organized with Detroit Will Breathe in the George Floyd uprisings, which is really what has motivated me the most as an activist. I'm also a street medic with the 313 Care Collective, and with that we support protests out in the streets, supplying any sort of support that we need to give as security as well as medics. I'm also now organizing with CPUSA and the YCL, but I'm here as an activist. So I did want to share what it means to be an activist to me. The things that I mostly care about is uniting the working class and the most oppressed. I care about fighting against the patriarchy, as it has definitely affected me as a Black queer person. I care about radicalizing young people and radicalizing the working class. I think that it's really important to build solidarity and to talk about what that word actually means. So for me, what solidarity means is more than just coming to these events, but actually getting to know one another and building sustainable relationships and building with each other and organizing and to understand our different fights and the ways that they intersect. I identify as a Black feminist, and I identify as an intersectional revolutionary. So for me, that means really focusing on the ways we can unite. There might not be everything, we might not agree on everything, but we can agree that we want to unite against capitalism, against imperialism, and to unite the working class. So for me, I really am focused on that and to fight for all oppressed people and to bring power to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sammie. So to introduce our fourth panelist here, Jerry Goldberg, I want to say one thing, a little story I have to tell you. So I was in one political party, he was in another political party. This could have been back in '65, I don't know when it was, long time ago. And I went to a Tiger game once, and here's Jerry Goldberg going down the aisle selling peanuts in the bags to all the thousands of sports people watching the baseball game. I go, God, and I'm watching him. He's like one after another bag of peanuts, making hundreds of dollars. Jeez, this is how this group makes money. So I told Harper, we got to start selling peanuts at the Tiger games. He found any way to do it. It was cool. But he's everywhere, and he's a tremendous activist and very strong and dedicated. We'd like to welcome Jerry Goldberg.
I want to thank Michigan Peace Council for organizing this event and for the tremendous work it's done in really playing a leading role in fighting imperialism in this city. It's Michigan Peace Council that's led the demonstrations against the U.S. intervention in Iraq that have occurred, in the U.S.-NATO proxy war against Russia that's occurred, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. In terms of myself, I don't represent a group right now, but I do represent a political current. I also come out of workers' world. David and I have been comrades for many years in the struggle, and I represent what we call the global class struggle current. And what does that mean? We see the world in the age of imperialism is really an age of global class struggle, with U.S. imperialism, really primarily U.S. imperialism on one side, and the workers, oppressed people, and socialist countries of the world on the other side. And it's an ongoing war, and that's how we define. And when we look at every particular struggle, we look at that struggle from its relationship to the global class struggle. I was at a conference a few years ago, a DSA conference, where I went to try to meet people, and there were a lot of great young people. But the older kind of ideologues said, well, we denounced what they called the campus theory. And they were talking about us. They were talking, we don't like these people who define the struggle so clearly between imperialism on one side and the workers and oppressed on the other. Well, we do. And we define what side we're on based on what side U.S. imperialism is. If U.S. imperialism is fighting a war, we know we're against it. And we begin from that point of view. When I became a revolutionary in the late 60s, that point of view was a lot easier, because the struggles of the oppressed nations fighting for liberation worldwide were led by socialists. You had the USSR, which was a socialist country at the center, and China was in its revolutionary heyday to the left of the USSR and promoting world revolution. Cuba, I went to Cuba in 1970, and there were countries from all over the world were there to cut cane as an act of solidarity with the Cubans. We met with the Vietnamese communists were heroes to us because they were defeating U.S. imperialism, was led by the Communist Party. In Africa, in Southern Africa, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique were all liberated by Marxists and set up socialist countries in those countries. South Africa, the ANC at that time, was led by communists. And I'm sure that if it wasn't for the overthrow of the Soviet Union, South Africa would be a socialist country today. We met with many of them. We used to bring them in all the time, and every representative we met was a communist. So it was easy. The global class struggle was in some ways easier then, because if you were a revolutionary, your allies were all revolutionary socialists, just like you, and they were inspiring us to become revolutionary socialists. But unfortunately, things didn't stay that way. And beginning in the late 1970s, a split developed in the socialist camp between China and the Soviet Union that had devastating consequences for the world movement. And it was a split very much sponsored by the U.S. They spent billions in the CIA. It was their biggest operation to launch that split. And in 1991, the Soviet Union as a socialist state collapsed. And it collapsed in some ways over its own weight, but it also collapsed under the weight of trying to maintain itself as a counterweight to U.S. imperialism on a much smaller economy. Well, when that happened, U.S. imperialism thought the world's over. They got it. The global class struggle is over. This is a new day in history. We can do whatever we want. And I read that since 1991, they've launched 251 military interventions all over the world. But despite their efforts to dominate the world and their cockiness that they thought they'd done, and they also thought China was going capitalist. And they did. The Chinese opened their door to capitalist elements to some degree under Deng Xiaoping. They opened their door, and they thought they had China. Just like every other country that opens its door to capitalism becomes a vassal of U.S. imperialism. But But in 1989, during the Tiananmen Square rebellion, the Chinese crushed the right wing. They maintained power as a communist party. And I'm not saying it's a pure communist state, but it's a communist state. And the capitalists don't have a free hand. And there's a Congress this week that I think is going to affirm how China is moving more and more in a socialist direction. And the other thing that surprised them is that Russia developed an alliance with China despite the government, Russia that they thought they had completely dismantled, that under Putin it regrouped some, and I'm not a defender of Putin or a supporter of Putin, you know, he's not a communist, but still, Russia and China became a counterweight to U.S. imperialism worldwide. And that's what they can't stand. And when I view the conflict in Ukraine, I view it from that point of view. That they thought they had what they called the unipolar world, really the complete domination, the free hand to dominate the world, and suddenly they realized they don't have that free hand. And China, I saw, especially after the Ukraine conflict began, and it was interesting, it was about Latin America, and they invoked the Cuban Missile Crisis, but what they showed was how China and Russia are lending solidarity to the developing nations all over Latin America to develop. And that's a threat to the U.S. Well, countries have a right to develop. And I think, I'll end there, but I think that's the key point, that we have to view this conflict in the context of the global class struggle, not so much, and it's not in maybe Putin's not pure, just like Assad wasn't pure in Syria, or Saddam Hussein wasn't pure, but when there's a conflict with U.S. imperialism, we have to know what side we're on, defend that side, and have the confidence that the people in that region, they'll cure their own ills. U.S. imperialism offers nothing to them.
Spoken like a true revolutionary, over 5 minutes, just to read. You have much more to say, I'm sure, and we love to hear what you say. So I'm sorry we have to do a time limit on this thing, but we want to give everybody a chance. The way we're going to do this now is, I just want to mention, I wanted to mention that he talked about the South African struggle, and it was in this room exactly, right on here, on this stage. I'm a musician, and our band was playing for a tour of Chris Hani, who was this great South African leader, who probably would have been the president if he'd have lived, but he was assassinated after he went back to his country. Chris Hani, H-A-N-I, check him out. We played for him right here. This museum sponsored him, and the U.S. Peace Council chapter brought him here. He was in this room right here, on this stage, in this room, Chris Hani. But we've been through many things in struggle. So yes, now it's time for the audience to ask questions. No comments, just questions to these four people. And I'm going to ask the first question, and then I'm going to ask those. So Sam is going to take the mic around. You're going to give it to that person first. But I have a question for Paula right here. And this is an issue that I have in Hamtramck, where I live, where there's a lot of Yemenis and Bangladeshis and immigrants, for sure, who are progressive, a lot of them. But they have fear that they can't speak out in this country. They can't start rallies and talk, because, you know, a lot of their family back home are in jeopardy. They very carefully control what they do in public. Some people don't care as much, I guess, but the vast majority. It's very hard for immigrants progressive immigrants especially, to voice their real true feelings. Do you feel that's a problem?
Yeah, I think that's a problem. I think that fear is also like a permanent, and I'm not sure if I got your question right, but I feel like fear has been, right, and it still is a permanent tool that imperialism uses against us. The capitalism and ruling class uses against us, not only immigrants, but immigrants for sure, in different ways, using our own government, local government, power, I don't know, armies, intelligence, all kind of stuff, in surveillance, thank you, in our home countries, but also is always backed up by the US imperialism. So the fear that we face to connect with our home countries is real because of all of that. It's also real because of the fear we face here. And it's daily, it's a daily thing. For example, here in Michigan, we don't have driver licenses to drive anywhere. So can you live like in daily fear because you can be picked up by police, which is, we already know, right? The racist they are. Then they take you to ICE, the migra, and then you can be just detained because having a bad light in your car and ended up in detention and separating your families. So we live in constant fear here and in our home countries when the puppets of our local governments are, not only accomplishes but also collaborating actively with the US imperialism all the time.
Thank you, Paula. Now, that gentleman, sure, back there.
Oh, okay.
Please say your name and who you're asking the question to.
This is for the panel, and my name is Sylvia McClinton. My question is, have you ever heard of the King Alfred Plan, Rex 84? You can all go on YouTube and get the details on what that is about. It is in the Congress of Libraries, so it's not a conspiracy. It is real about our corrupt government. Also, how do we unbrainwash the population that does not know that they are being divided and conquered on a daily and for decades? Thank you.
Thank you. So I cannot speak to the first thing that you brought up, but I do want to speak to the second thing, and I want to use a quote by Malcolm X. The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that's power because they control the mind of the masses. So I wanted to use that quote because I think that it's important that we take advantage of the media. I think that it's important that we use our own publications, but that also we take control of existing publications and news outlets to our own benefit. I think that it's really important that we control the propaganda that is being pushed and that we get the truth out there to all the people that really want it and really need it so that we can build a mass revolution.
Thank you, Sammie. Anyone else on the panel want to address it?
I also can't talk about what you were asking, the first part, but that's really the biggest question. Because those of us in this room, even if we agreed on everything, just so much we could do. There's still millions and millions more in this area, in the state, and of course hundreds of millions in the country. And it's just going to have to, it's an educational process combined with a struggle. People's own experiences will lead them eventually to see the light, and so to speak. I'll just speak from my own experience. I was 16, 1966. Yeah. And I wanted to enlist to fight in Vietnam against the evil communists and for freedom. Because that seemed like a thing that I was brought up to believe in. And I didn't feel good having a student deferment. Well, I wasn't old enough to enlist. And luckily I had a number of friends in college, I was in New York City at the time, who were very patient with me. And we started looking at things like the agreements that were written up after the French and the Chinese defeat. And what were they called? Anyway, 1954. And they said there was supposed to be an election. Well, why didn't that election take place in all of Vietnam? Well, Eisenhower said it in his memoirs. Because Ho Chi Minh would have won. Now I'm thinking, wait a minute, something's wrong. I've been misinformed. Didn't happen all at once, but it took a while. But within another year, I was refusing to go to the military. So you know, and within another year or two after that, by 1969, the majority of the country was against the war. But it didn't stop. People think, oh yeah, everyone was against the war. No, Dr. King was ostracized when he spoke out against the war. Ostracized by the black leadership. And I remember leafleting at a subway stop in New York City against the war, against the draft and against the war. I almost was lynched. A mob surrounded me, started pushing me around. A few friends came in and dragged me out. But a year or two later, most of those people were probably protesting the war. It can happen, it just takes a lot of effort. And I want to address this later when we ask the second question. But I'm not pessimistic. They have they spend a lot of money and a lot of the media and to bombard people, but ultimately people's own interests will command some respect from themselves.
Thank you, David. Who's Jerry?
Just 1 minute, because this is an important question. This is a situation today where the media whip up around the Ukraine conflict is like almost unprecedented. It's every day. And it's beaten over. It's interesting that the meeting began with a quote from Mark Ruffalo, a terrible quote from Mark Ruffalo. Mark Ruffalo is usually a very progressive guy. He was out here marching against the water shutoffs with us. And that's what they've done. You don't hear any of even the progressive Congress people. Not one of the squad has issued a statement on Ukraine. They don't feel they can. Barbara Lee, who's always the one vote you could count on in Congress to be with us in Iraq, went with Pelosi to the Ukraine. So it's a real, almost an unprecedented, for many years, ruling class media onslaught to whip up support. It's difficult. And it has its effect. And what makes it more difficult is they're using the Ukrainians as their proxies in the war. Now, if there were U.S. troops fighting that war, it'd be a lot different. There'd be a lot of opposition. It wouldn't be so hard to whip up opposition here. But they're not doing that. They're slick in the way they're doing it. So I do think there's two parts. The one thing I would say to this answer is there are two parts to it. We can't ignore kind of the ideological question. We can't ignore meetings like this, which sometimes we think, wow, this is a meeting among activists. But we have to strengthen the activists and broaden the activists who are willing to stand up to the ruling class on this onslaught. Because we are the ones that are the core of the movement. And then we know, but once we have our activists strengthened and feeling confident and united and defend those who stand up, look at how they attacked the leader of the African People's Socialist Party for speaking out. We got to build, but we got to strengthen the core of activists, and then we know how to make the links. Obviously, the billions they're spending on Ukraine are weapons, are money that should be going for human needs at home. The effect it's having on the debt, how they're increasing the debt service, who's going to pay for that? Inflation's way up. We know how to make the links, but first we got to also deal with the ideological struggle of where we stand fundamentally in this conflict.
That deserves an applause, I think. Almost everything Jerry says deserves an applause. He talks like that. It's like it's so powerful when he speaks. I've always enjoyed his rousing style of motivating people to action. I have a little quote I want to say, and then we're going to let this gentleman ask a question. Ron Jacobs from Counterpunch said, Ukraine is the perfect war for the U.S.-dominated military-industrial complex. There's no body bags coming home. There's no anti-war demonstrations, and virtually no pressure for negotiations. Indeed, a substantial portion of what usually constitutes the U.S. anti-war movement is actually cheering on the Ukrainian military in this conflict. In short, this is a dream situation, and Washington and its minions will fight to the last Ukrainian to keep the war industry's profits rolling in. That's Ron Jacobs. Next.
Hello, I'm Sam Coffey. I live in Ann Arbor. This is for Jerry. I had a question. I believe you said something about how the CIA helped cause the Chinese-Soviet Union split, and I'd like to understand that, and let me follow up with, it's my understanding that Khrushchev renounced Stalin, and that helped cause the split, so if I'm mistaken, please correct me.
That's a good question and a big answer, I guarantee you. So let's keep this short.
A little bit too big for this meeting, and there are many factors that went into that split. and I'd be glad to talk about them with you. But the CIA did play a big role, because that was their policy. They wanted that split. So I'm not saying the CIA was the sole factor. There are many factors, and we can talk about that.
Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question. I do want to say that when we get to the Q&A after these three questions, my co-chair from Michigan Peace Council is with us here. Her name is Linda Rayburn. Please stand up, Linda, or wave your hand. We're so glad you're here. She made it in time. She's got a full life of activities, and I was worried she wasn't going to come and help me with the second half. She's going to do the Q&A with all you guys. So thank you, Linda, for being here. So the second question, General, is about defining terminology, like imperialism, like capitalism, like we mentioned, monopoly capitalism, colonialism. You know, a lot of the left is divided. Here's another quote from Greg Goldberg. I don't know if you know who he is, from ML Today. He said, "The great tragedy is that the broad left, the historical foil to war and imperialism, remains divided, confused, and inactive, while a bloody, destructive war rages, threatening to expand and escalate." Why is the left so divided? Is it because we have different ideas of what imperialism really is? And we know there's many different definitions of it. One pretty much is clear that it's an economic force. It's the way that imperialism controls the money and economic resources in other countries, the financial institutions, banks. That's the most powerful aspect of imperialism. But we see it as the U.S., for example, has 800 military bases around the world, so that's imperialism. So what is imperialism? If you want to add any definition to it, if you want to describe how it's different from colonialism, what is colonialism? I mean, maybe some of us don't know these terms clearly enough. So this is a chance for each of us to address anything we want to address as far as terminology and what we're dealing with in this subject matter. So we're going to start that in with Jerry, and then we'll come this way. So Jerry, I know you have a lot of terminology in your head there.
I was trying to find Lenin's definition here.
Yeah, he's going to look for a definition. Cool. So we're going to start with Sammie, and then we'll go with Sammie, and then we'll go to Jerry.
So to me, imperialism is utilizing hypermilitarization to gain domination. It's based on power and profits, which is similar to colonialism, but instead of gaining control of the land, it's about influencing a country for still power and control. I also think that it's important to recognize that imperialism, while it's worldwide, it also exists within our own country through the means of police brutality. So I think that that is a mirror image as the police and some military forces such as the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have the same training. So imperialism is a worldwide problem, and it's a problem in our own country. Colonialism, to me, is the occupation of land. For example, Israel and Palestine. It's about controlling the people and using that land for exploitation and capitalistic purposes.
Great start.
Might pass for a minute still. Go ahead.
Okay, so we're going to go over here then. Jerry's looking for whatever you want to add to it.
Okay, I like to talk in simple terms because of my passion for political popular education. So for me, colonialism is basically, and maybe I'm going to speak in a very more testimonial way from my home country and maybe what I've seen as a Latin American and Chilean woman. But for me, colonialism is organized robbery, looting, and stealing of our motherland and our natural resources. First, in the name of the Queen, the King, God, and Jesus too. And later, and of course that was a lot of genocide and stealing, right? But also imperialism right now, I mean, imperialism for me is the obedient, well-educated son of colonialism in that way. What I mean by this is that I see imperialism in our home countries as a continuity of the colonialism kind of stealing process. And then we can see, like, in the, I don't know, for example, when the Industrial Revolution, right? The US and European immigrants in our countries were building the bourgeoisie for making profit for their own interests, creating infrastructure and institutions to keep the stealing, coming initially from the European or the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire too, in the case of Brazil, to keep basically stealing, exploiting and oppressing our people. Initially with the foreign industry to extract the natural resources, to the global center exportation of the markets in the US, Europe, and the Asian markets later, but also controlling the politics of our local governments to keep our people subjugated and oppressed, to keep that process going on, right? I'd say that imperialism, the US imperialism probably is the more killer of us, of all, and with the military and the deadly forces that, and with active interventionism in our local politics and governments. And we can see that in the 20th century, right? With a lot of, I want to mention maybe a couple of examples. So I remember the Operation Condor. I don't know if you have heard about that, but in the 60s, like Jerry was mentioning, right? There were a lot of Latin American countries organizing and looking for their freedom for more socialist, communist societies. Oh, it's done. So a lot of dictatorship, the right-wing local governments were actually kind of organized by the US imperialism. And one of the big expressions of this was Operation Condor, which is basically an counterintelligence process, state terror, assassination, and disappearances of people, movement, and revolutionaries, and just social, just people trying to find their way far away from the US imperialism. And this was like, basically, organized by the US and the local dictatorships. And it was in Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, all the South America cone. We also have, someone mentioned, the School of Americas, right? So military bases in all our countries. We have military bases in our countries, but also we have this school who has been trained more than 90,000 military guys from our countries who had become the most worst violators of human rights in our countries.
Thank you, Paula.
I think most of us would agree with Sammie on the definition. What's a related question is why some people have trouble recognizing an imperialist war when it breaks out. It doesn't do any good to be against the war in retrospect, 5 years, 2 years later. At the beginning of these wars, it's very important. I just want to touch on a few of them. The first Iraq War, hundreds of thousands massacred by the United States, the early 90s, followed by over 10 years of sanctions. And Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, was proud to announce, when asked, when she was told 500,000 children had died from sanctions, medicine being forbidden to be sent to Iraq, And the guy, interviewer asked, was it worth it? She says, I believe it was worth it. But a lot of people, if they may have opposed the original war, but I remember in coalitions here arguing with people whose slogan was, let sanctions work. That was the slogan of some of the anti-war movement. And sanctions are an act of war. You can't go that way. A few years later, U.S. sent troops into Somalia. I remember having a fight with family members who normally should have known better. But they said, but there's a famine, and African people are dying in Somalia from the famine. And then U.S. troops were sent in, supposedly to aid. Except the New York Times revealed 6 months later that the famine had ended a year before. And that there was no famine at that time. And of course the Somalis fought, the famous Black Hawk helicopter was shot down, and the U.S. ran out of there licking its wounds. But there were people, including some of my family members, who were thinking they were helping the African people by supporting U.S. troops going in. Yugoslavia was a somewhat socialist country for many decades after being liberated from the Nazis by Tito and the Communist Party. It was broken up in the 1990s by all the different nationalities who had lived together in peace and in cooperation. It was broken up. They were been pitted against each other. Germany had a hand in it, Spain, France, and of course the United States. But everyone here, Milosevic is the Hitler. That was the term. By the way, they said Saddam was a Hitler. Funny how everyone keeps being a Hitler except when they're coming from the U.S. And Yugoslavia was broken down, a lot of fighting and a lot of misinformation. I don't want to get into the whole thing. The Second Iraq War, same thing. Weapons of mass destruction. They swore in front of the UN, here is a truck with weapons of mass destruction. They were lying. It came out. It's been shown that it was lies, complete lies. 10 years later, Libya, the most prosperous country in Africa, was overthrown, bombed into smithereens. The president, leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi, was murdered, and that was celebrated by Hillary Clinton when he was assassinated. And of course, the country was bombed. And to this day, no real state has supplanted that government. It's a complete chaos. And one thing we saw a number of years ago, they had, I can't say that they have this year, but they had for a number of years slave markets where people were being sold on platforms, just like something out of 1850 or something. Yeah. And now the Ukraine. We can't get into, maybe we can't get into the Ukraine, but Russ added something, but a lot of people, I watch the New York Times every day. There was no op-ed piece against that war until 95 days after the Russian Federation Special Military Intervention operation. 95 days without a commentary, even an opposition commentary. And of course there's tons of stuff. We have a pamphlet on the back, it's for sale, but we've documented this from the before and after the February invasion and up to the current period, and it's overwhelming. But if you don't know this, if you just hear certain things, you're frankly brainwashed.
Wow, uncanny. That was 5 minutes again. You're really good at that. Got a clock in his head. But the question is about definitions right now, so we want to try to stick to that if we can. And we'll get into the history stuff also, if it has to do with defining.
Okay. Well, I think, it's been explained well. I thought Sammie said it very well itself. I mean, Lenin defined imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, is a stage where it's really the final and developed stage of capitalism, where the system is run by a small number of monopoly corporations, or integrated with the banks, And to maintain their rate of profit, they essentially have to exploit the whole world. They can't do it just on the domestic market, so they have to go worldwide. And that's really what imperialism is under Lenin. It's defined and still what imperialism is. What defines modern imperialism, though, and that's particularly U.S. imperialism, which when we talk about imperialism, we need to be talking about U.S. imperialism, is that it's a warfare state. I was doing a little research for this panel. The military budget for the U.S. is $840 billion. And that doesn't include another $85.5 billion that's spent on the CIA and military intelligence. Russia, who they want to define as an imperialist rival, its military budget is $65 billion. China's military budget is $230 billion. Last week we were submitted to a whole thing about how North Korea is a threat against the U.S. North Korea's military budget is $1.6 billion, far less than the $5 billion that New York City spends on the police force. So what defines imperialism in the modern age is the need to exploit the world for the profits of the monopoly corporations that finance capital, but it's defined by having the military to carry out those policies on behalf of those corporations. And make no mistake, it's the U.S. that are the bullies of the world, that they are the military aggressors worldwide, and really our task, of course, is to dismantle the Pentagon and dismantle this whole system.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. So if we have questions from the audience, and let's start with this gentleman here. He hasn't asked one yet. If you know who you want to direct a question to, just a question. Thank you.
Well, it's to the panel. Isn't the definition we should really focus on is what is the mindset of materialism? I've studied Martin Luther King's Riverside speech, however you know that speech, and he talks about the three triplets of militarism, racism, and what's the other one? There's another one in there. But it seems...
Well, that's a good quiz. Let's ask somebody who knows what the third one is. Martin Luther King. I remember reading that. I can't think of the third one.
Militarism, capitalism, or it might be capitalism.
Not capitalism, it wasn't.
Well, anyhow, to me, the other two stem from materialism. And so that should be, in all these, like imperialism, these imperialistic programs, seems to be coming from a materialistic mindset.
So the question is?
So shouldn't we be focusing on the subject of materialism?
Okay. Anyone want to address that? That's sort of like...
Because that kind of goes along with David Soul's things, why we're divided. When the Iraq escalation of violence happened on Iraq people, millions of people marched in, 2002 March, and on a Saturday. But then, they all vanished and they didn't want to speak out against their Republican CEO, leadership.
So that was an example to help us try to define materialism.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Anyone want to tackle that? It's a Marxist-Leninist thing, isn't it? Materialism versus idealism?
I feel like that is an important question because I think that the whole concept of imperialism and colonialism is based in materialism and based in capitalism. The U.S. has the power to oppress and repress anyone by any means in order to build capitalism. So imperialism is essentially a tool, as well as materialism and imperialism are a tool to maintain capitalism. And the U.S. will use their greatest forces against anyone that does stand in that way. So it is definitely an important question to tackle and something that we have to build unity and solidarity on.
Thank you. I'll add that there's historical materialism and dialectical materialism. There's lots of materialism, so some of us know about that.
That's a long talk, too. But philosophically, materialism is simply taking reality and analyzing it. That's really what historical materialism, what happened up from then to now and how did it affect things. What I'm getting from your question, sir, is materialism in the sense that people want things. material objects. And I don't think that's a helpful way of approaching things, because we need to talk about whether they're poor and working people who want food and medicine and a decent place to live. Those are things that everyone needs and should have a right to. And if those things improve year to year, that's not a bad thing either. We all want things better for ourselves and our children. Materialist greediness, that's another question. But really, the bulk of the wealth in this country is in the hands of a tiny number of people, a billionaire class. We call it the ruling class, the capitalist class. And it's completely different. What they want, and even their need for increasing that is built into the system. You know, there used to be a Rockefeller, John Rockefeller. And then he had some kids, and they were running things in Chase Bank and things like that. You could see them, and you could kind of personalize your hatred for them. But who knows the Rockefellers now? It's a family of hundreds, if not more. And they get their money, but they're not operating things. Now it's CEOs on their behalf and bankers on their behalf. The whole system is designed. You know, they said that a chief executive officer of a giant corporation, if they don't increase profits every 3 months, they're out. Well, that means they can't even have any long-term planning. This whole economic system is degrading because capitalism is not working anymore. This imperialist and capitalist monopoly system does not advance things. You know, you could say one thing about the robber barons from the 1890s. They built factories and they exploited workers. They were horrible. The conditions were horrible. But they built things. Nowadays, they steal pension funds. They manipulate Wall Street. You know, this is built into the system.
Yeah, thank you. Good comments. Okay, we have a question right there.
Yeah, I got a quick question. Could anyone on this panel tell me who and what is the purpose of a United Nations that calls out all the crimes against humanity, the lack of people getting reparations? We see all groups all around us, been across there, but the people that built this country and made it America still waiting for protections as well as reparations.
So the United Nations was set up during World War II, right after, supposedly to bring things together. Its predecessor was the League of Nations, and it was really the capitalist Western powers. Even when the UN was formed, people say, well, Israel was created by the United Nations. How many African countries were independent at that time? What, Ethiopia, maybe one other? South Africa? And that was apartheid South Africa? The UN was still dominated by the capitalists, but the Soviet Union, socialist at the time, was really the one block to them, doing just what they wanted, because they had a veto in the UN. There was a movement in the 1960s when there were a lot of liberation movements. They formed the Non-Aligned Conference, and that might have grown, if things had gone better, have grown into a socialist and non-aligned United Nations type of organization. But right now, this is all there is. It still exists, but it's not a powerful force. And so, China, People's China wasn't even included, till 1972, I believe. Yeah. So the UN has a couple of countries that basically resist imperialism somewhat. Russia does a somewhat, trying to resist U.S. imperialism. Cuba is in there, but it's really dominated by the Western imperialist powers. I think every year there's a vote about the sanctions against Cuba, and which are a brutal thing. And 150 countries or more vote against it, and 2 countries vote for it, I think US and Israel, maybe some other country. But they keep the sanctions going. So, we don't put a lot of faith in the United Nations. Those revolutionaries don't, but it's just another arena for struggle.
I'd like to add something, again, from like my Chilean view. And maybe it's an anecdote, but I think it's like a, you know, a sample. Michelle Bachelet was the first woman president in Chile under the tutelated, or like the formal democracy that we had after the dictatorship. She had two governments, 2 times she was the president. Under her 2 times, she and her government and the Congress just dig deeper the neoliberalism policies, privatization, the Mapuche people, who is native people taking back their land, and a great example for the revolutionary movements in Latin America, had a lot of political prisoners and killed people by the Michelle Bachelet police force and army force. When she left the second term, she was named the chief of the Human Rights Officer Commission for the Indigenous People in the UN. So, for me, the UN is actually, like, in the best of the cases and in the most progressive occasions, doing capitalism more like humanist capitalism, and, you know, under the narrative of the human rights that are not even like granted in the countries that are part of the United Nations. And
Thank you, Paula. All right, so what I think we're going to do is, we had a third question, but it's going longer than we had thought, so we're going to skip the third question, which is actually the question of where do we go from here, and how do we overcome U.S. imperialism, how do we work together. This is all going to come out in the Q&A with the audience. I think we can all respond to that when we answer questions from the audience. So we're going to move on to the second part of the program, where you can ask questions or you can make a comment, whatever you want to do. And we're going to turn this in a minute. Okay, I'm going to let Linda deal with this one. Linda is going to head this Q&A section and make notes of who's on the list in what order. And let's welcome Linda Rayburn.
Hey everyone, nice to see you. Glad to be here, like always. So again, like Bill was just saying, I'm Linda Rayburn, and we're going to get going with this Q&A. So, would you like to ask the question again?
Several days ago, a report came out that talked about the Azov Battalion, or brigade, or whatever title they choose to anoint themselves with, which is a creation of the Banderist Nazis whose origins in World War II and its conduct resulted in the death of millions of people. They were mass murderers, and they, in 2014, were organized to go into eastern Ukraine by the Kiev government and by the U.S. Government, and they were armed by the U.S., although nobody officially can prove that, and they murdered about 14,000 people. Today, they're in Congress and they're being embraced by both parties as to get rid of the ban that was originally put in by Congressman John Conyers to ban funding of Azov Nazis in Ukraine. That was removed through pressure from the Obama administration, and another congresswoman from California, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. She got it put in. And now Democrats and Republicans, according to this article, are saying, oh, that should never have been in the bill. You know, that was just something, we never even read it and stuff like that. We want to repeal it. So that the United States can be officially funding the largest military force of Nazis in the world on the world stage today. which will be a permanent feature of post-war war in Ukraine. The United States is going to do it officially, and Congress is going to embrace it. What in the hell are we going to do about this? How are we going to organize? How are we going to educate? And we don't have a month to talk about this. This could happen before the November elections, or it could happen in lame duck. We need to act now. I guess I'm asking you, what do you say? What do you think we can do to fight this phenomenon?
Can I ask a question? Is it part of the law now that they can't fund the Azov?
Yes.
But they are.
So they do it through covert means, and they do it through the British, and they do it through putting them like legally inside the Ukrainian military. So that, you know, but yeah, as soon as they overthrew the government in 2014, in February of 2014, they were immediately blessed with artillery and tanks and heavy weaponry, and trained on it. The 173rd Airborne Brigade there was sent in to do training, military training for the Ukrainian military, including, I believe, Azov and probably C-19 and other Nazi groups. How can we organize and fight this? Because this is a disgrace on humanity. We have to have a public record of fighting this glorification of Nazism. By the way, United States and Ukraine is the only two countries in the world that voted against the resolution to condemn Nazism in the world.
Thanks again for being here, and thank you for that question. I think that, David, you had your hand up. You want to tackle that?
Yes. The expert on this is Brother Russ Bellant. He's been documenting fascism and fascists in the U.S. and in Ukraine for many, many years now. I just want to, we're going to fight it. We're going to organize next week. There's a protest. We need to all participate, get our groups and our friends out. There's no simple answer to this. We need to pound it. I hope maybe someone will have you speak. I'm not organizing it next week, but maybe you can speak at the rally with the march. Medea Benjamin's speaking inside, but there's a march with a rally afterwards. So this has to be brought up. But the U.S. funding of this whole operation, it goes way back, and I don't want to detail all of it, but hopefully you know, the U.S. admitted that they carried out the coup in 2014. They financed it, they carried it out, and picked the person to replace them. And when some people from the European Union said, they were told that, Victoria Nuland said this, she was told, well, some of our European allies don't see it that way. She said, fuck them. That's what she said. It was on tape. The Russians leaked it, by the way, in 2014. And then, as you said, starting in there was some fighting. The Russian ethnic people in the Donbass, that's two provinces in the east, set up people's republics. And the Azov and the regular military went to the east and were shelling them, fighting. And there was a peace treaty, 2 peace treaties brokered in Minsk, guaranteed by France and Germany, but it was never obeyed. And it's guaranteed that the ethnic Russian people in the Donetsk and the Lugansk provinces would have autonomy, not independence, but autonomy. And on that basis, there was supposed to be peace, but as you said, 14,000 have been killed in those 8 years. And frankly, the Russian Federation intervened only because large numbers of Ukrainian troops and heavy weapons were heading towards the border of those 2 provinces, and the Russians moved preemptively to stop that. So, you know, we can go into that. But 80 billion in the last so many months, what is it, 6-7 months, $80 billion. I know some people who were not that favorable, not that opposed to the war, but when they started hearing about that, they started thinking, what do we need that for? Yeah, we could use some of that here. So, and the other thing, by the way, and I'll stop there, the U.S. Funded a Ukrainian organization, government organization, that has made a hit list of reporters such as Scott Ritter and Eva Bartlett and others, U.S. citizens and others who are on a literal hit list as Russian terrorists. And you can look that up. We have our pamphlet that discusses some of that. But the U.S. is financing this, and as someone said, they're ready to fight. The Pentagon's ready to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood.
Thanks, David. So Sammie wants to speak as well.
I think that the question isn't, are we going to oppose of this, but how? And with that, I think that it's important to keep doing the things that we have been doing and to continue to build solidarity with all sorts of organizations and people that are already fighting. So we don't want that money to go to funding U.S. imperialism. We need money here. We have people that are being evicted. We have people who are fighting rent increases. We have people who are starving and can't eat. We have a big homelessness problem here in this country. And it's important that we fight alongside each other and build with each other on the problems that exist here so that we can focus on making sure that that funding is going to the people, not to U.S. imperialism. So I did want to talk a little bit more about pandemic and inflation because of it. And I think that that's something that is affecting a lot of us. And we are struggling to make ends meet, and we are struggling to really work through burnout, which is why it's important to work more with each other and to show up for each other in our events and meetings. So I think that is really where we need to prioritize so that we can oppose of this.
Just real briefly, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, but, you know, Russ, I would suggest that you write up a memo about this, send it around. Maybe the Center for Constitutional Rights or someone could file a legal action. It might be the kind of thing, if it's a law that's being violated, I'm not a, we know bourgeois law is bourgeois law, but sometimes it's a way to break through when the movement isn't that strong to bring it out. So I would suggest let's look into that. Maybe I wish I could do it myself right now. I'm just not in a position.
I did do a write-up on it, and I emailed it out, and I sent the article that I referenced in it.
Well, send it to me again, and I'll share it.
Yeah, I sent it to several of you, but, if you're like me, you get behind in your emails. Right. Yeah, but it's in there. And if anybody wants it, I'll be glad to talk to them one-on-one here and get your address and send it to you.
Thank you so much. So I see that we have a lot of people that want to speak, which is really exciting. So we're going to have actually about a minute per person that wants to speak. So go ahead.
Okay. So earlier I was formulating my question, and the question was going to be, we go to so many seminars, webinars, Zoom meetings, and all the experts who've been studying for 20, 30, 40, even 50 years speak, and they speak and almost have an answer, what's going to end imperialism. And we all hear little things here and there, but nothing that, you can sort of take home with you that makes you feel really good. And so then I was thinking, well, what could the answer be? And the thing that came to me, and there's a lot of young people here, and that's very hopeful, but with the Vietnam War, I only have a minute. With the Vietnam War, we got rid of the draft, but that was not much more than that. And I kind of believe that it's going to be the destruction of the environment that's going to change imperialism, because imperialism is not going to work in taking care of it. And I just would wonder if anyone has any comments on that.
Thank you, Sharon. Come on up. Please state your name.
Hi, my name's Mike Shane. I'm with the Moratorium Now Coalition. First, the three pillars that the gentleman back here was referring to is war, racism, and poverty. The Modern Poor People's Campaign has added the question of environmental destruction. But I think the first three points to what we need to do. I don't know if you all know it. Look at your next gas bill, but my neighbor told me our gas rate went up from 0.3 0.39 per unit to 0.57 per unit, a 57% increase effective September. We know why it's going up, right? It's the Ukraine war and Biden shipping all our natural gas around the world, trying to make immense profits. I want the panelists to comment on the possibility of us linking the domestic struggle for survival to the international struggle for survival. In Detroit, we have no low-income housing available right now. It is so bad that the nonprofits are talking about safe parking lots for women and children who have no place to go so they can poison themselves in carbon monoxide, but at least it'll be in a safe, secure. This was actually discussed last week among the nonprofits. We have lead contamination in the water in the city of Detroit. We need $1 billion in Detroit to fix it. This is an opportunity, and I hope you all can comment on it, the opportunities we have to explain to people on the ground why we're in the conditions we are. It seems that we could tie the two together, because you can't, Martin Luther King said, every bomb in Vietnam is a bomb going off in the ghettos of the United States. Maybe we need to revive that concept. And the people in Detroit are desperate. And anyway, I'd like you all to comment on it, because we gotta mobilize the working class here. And ideologically, they may not be able to, we might not win them there, but we'll win them in their hearts and minds and in their bellies.
Go ahead, Sammie.
Yeah, I think that was kind of what I was trying to get at earlier when I was referring to building with each other on the issues that already exist. It's important that we are focusing in on these issues, and it is a way that we can, recruit people in. I think that meeting people with their values is incredibly important because people value being taken care of. They value having their needs met, and clearly with the state of the world and the country right now, needs are not being met. They're not being prioritized, and we have the opportunity to really build off of that.
Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree also that I used to say, like, connecting the dots, right? So for me, we are in this survival mode, and we need to start, like Sammie was saying, between us. I also feel like sometimes our struggles are so isolated and kind of segregated, and we become experts in water shutoffs, or experts on housing issues, or experts on women's rights, right? When it's all connected. So I feel like we need to start very, very basic within us, and connecting the dots between the struggles, and also connecting the dots. That's for me, maybe it sounds very basic, but without political education, we don't have a working class willing to fight for their, for transforming this system. And then we need, and someone was saying the materialism thing, I say it like, we need to win concrete victories of ourselves, our people's needs, right? We need to win. We need to win small things that give us hope that an alternative of coming together to organize, mobilize, and push the limits of what they have telling us is possible is real, and it's possible. And I feel like people is experts on their needs. We don't need to tell what is going on in the basic, like, daily conditions, right? What we need to be better is connect that with the bigger picture, right? And so that's why for me, really, like, political education is doing those bridges. How we connect what is going on with the water shutoffs, the housing, the immigration. We also have a first level between struggles, like local struggles, and then national struggles, and then international struggles, and imperialism, and all of that. And I think it makes sense like with simple things. It's not like the theory is going one way and the real life is going the other way. I think that our main challenge and just being able to build those bridges or connecting those dots in a simple way that makes sense, again, because our people, they are the experts on what is going on at the daily conditions of our lives, basically.
Just on that, because it's very important, obviously it's the question of the day. And I agree, I think this is a time where we need to find a coming together of the various activists and organizations on how to develop a programmatic approach to the current crisis in Detroit. The key to it, of course, is how to develop a programmatic approach that points the finger at the system. That's a transition from the immediate needs of the people to seeing that it's the system that caused them. We did a good job of that in Moratorium Now and all of us in the bankruptcy by being able to raise the role of the banks and expose finance capital. And we did a great job, I think, of bringing an anti-capitalist perspective into a day-to-day struggle around housing and around the bankruptcy. But we didn't win. We weren't strong enough to win. Since that time, what we've seen in Detroit is kind of proliferation of nonprofits and of many youth who want to see immediate change. So what they do is they hook up with a nonprofit who offers a small reform, but as part of that small reform, they're selling out the struggle to the bigger picture. Because the nonprofits, the corporations, Gilbert and them, don't give money, give a few $1 million to help people being evicted without a quid pro quo that you don't go after the billions that they've stolen from the people. So I think that is what's needed for the anti-capitalists to come together and to develop and sharpen our transitional demands, our demands that link the day-to-day struggle of the working class to the movement against capitalism. And we got to come together and grapple with how to move that forward under the concrete relations that exist today. But I think now's the time to do it.
Thank you, Jerry.
I just have a comment, no response required, same copy still. Yeah, I want to touch on the United Nations, which is a liberal organization that I think people should try to use for what it's worth. But I'm remembering, I forget how many years ago, a comment Putin made criticizing the U.S. for not following international law. But the U.S. likes to tell other people to follow international law, but no one can tell the U.S. what to follow. So I think the UN and international law in general is a good way to demonstrate U.S. hypocrisy and U.S. imperialist hypocrisy. Thank you.
If you feel comfortable, please state your name.
Oh, Sam Copy, I did. I
And
just didn't say it from Ann Arbor.
Also, can you
Ann Arbor Coalition Against the War.
Ann Arbor Coalition Against the War. And also, can you show off your shirt? The newspaper strike in '95. Thank you.
Unfortunately, they did.
The 96 shirt says surrender, so.
Thank you so much.
We didn't surrender.
Matthew Evans, United States Constitutional Army. We're working on revitalizing the constitution of our individual bodies that's been, of course, ravaged lately, as well as the Constitution of the United States. I've got a little display in the corner if you want to know what I'm up to. What I'm looking for is people to help me update Martin Luther King's life sacrifice, his demands, and his call to action from the Riverside speech, which I first learned of from A.J. Muste as the Declaration of Independence from the war in Vietnam. And now there's a poster from A.J. Muste on the second floor there where he makes the statement, "There is no way to peace. Peace is the way." So if you want to entertain that, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Is today Che's birthday? I've been seeing it on Facebook.
It's the anniversary of the day that he was murdered.
Okay, right on.
October 9th, 1967.
Can you please repeat that on the mic?
October 9th, 1967 is the day that Che Guevara was murdered in an operation.
By the CIA.
By the CIA. I think that we're all here to build socialism. And going back to what Russ was talking about, my view is a huge obstacle that we're facing as we try to build socialism is the rehabilitation of Nazism. It's a very frightening phenomenon, and it's part of the revisionist history of the Soviet Union and what happened during World War II. Over and over again now, we hear constantly that it wasn't the Soviet Red Army that defeated the Nazis and that they were just as bad or they were in collusion with the Nazis. This is a very serious issue for the left, and I'm not seeing it really addressed any more than the left addressed the pandemic, which you mentioned, which is a catastrophe for the working class as well. And so if somebody would like to say, if you're seeing something that I'm missing about the left taking on this issue of the revisionist history of World War II and the defeat of Nazism, please share it with me.
Thank you. Would you like to state your name?
Did I not? I'm
No.
sorry. My name is Catherine Wilkerson, and I live in Ann Arbor, and I work with the Ann Arbor Coalition Against the War. And I just joined the U.S. Peace Council, so I hope to be doing more activities with you guys.
Does anyone want to elaborate, discuss that? Maybe just discuss it after? Thank you, Catherine. Well, David was going to say something.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with so-called what you're referring to as revisionist history. You know, I've always understood who defeated the Nazis. It was the Red Army. You know, I mean, there are even Hollywood movies about Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk and how many died, 20, 30 million at least dead in the Soviet Union in the war. U.S. lost 250,000. Not to put down 250,000 dead, but 25, 30 million. So I'm not sure who's saying now that, you know, must be pretty anti-communist ideologues who are saying that. But that's pretty well documented. There was a Soviet Union that defeated Nazism. There's a lot more. That's a whole other forum.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mitchell Blonga, and I'm an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I've got a question for all the panelists. Silvia Federici and many other Marxists have detailed how capitalism is just instilled with patriarchy through its very development during the transition from feudalism to capitalism, where there was the violent displacement of women and gender-based oppression instilled. So I'm just curious, on this topic of imperialism, how has, throughout the development of capitalism in this 500-year history, how has that manifested through imperialism and gender-based oppression around the world?
To sort of speak on that, I think that something that we have to make sure that we identify is the ways that the patriarchy shows up in our own movement spaces. So for me, I think that's something I'm very passionate about, and I would like to fight a lot more and have more comrades fight along beside me with that, because the patriarchy definitely is what's keeping us down, and I think that we really need to focus on talking to the most oppressed people and also understanding the ways that some of the oppressed can be the oppressor. So, for instance, black men are also capable of sexism, whereas white women are capable of racism. And I think that those are things that are important to identify, and the ways that it does show up as we fight against capitalism and imperialism, because again, it does exist in our movement spaces. So I think that that is something that we have to tackle internally and talk about a lot more externally as well. Again, I recognize as a black feminist, and I am here to fight for the most oppressed. And I think that we need to work on identifying what that means a little bit more.
Thank you so much. Paula would like to respond.
Yeah, in my experience, I also been a part of the Chilean feminist movement which is very different that the mainstream see here, like the women's rights that have been really very condescending with the capitalism and with a very wide view. So I see that machismo, how we call it, basically like the first level or the more obvious level of patriarchy in Latin America, has a lot to do with colonialism and imperialism in the minds. So colonialism and imperialism is not only economics and politics and profits and stealing in our lands, but that can be done because the ideological fight, right? And so since colonialism, they told us you are inferior in general to the native people who were there. So Spanish Empire and later the US and the Europeans in general told us you are inferior, you have to obey, you don't have power, and then the sword, the Bible, most of the time, the military boot were kind of the symbols of colonialism and later imperialism, but also patriarchism at the same time. So yeah, I totally agree with Sammie that we have kept that in our minds and in our relationships so long. And usually revolutionary movements have been focused more in the economics and the politics and all of that, but it's overdue that we understand that there is no fight against capitalism without fight against patriarchy. And patriarchy is not something that only happens in the White House, it happens every day in our lives. And so it's also this like fight in our minds and changing our relationships. And of course, those who said that in Chile we don't say I am a revolutionary, never. It's like a way to go. It's like an ending thing. So it's weird to me, but it's a cultural learning. But if we say I'm a revolutionary, you cannot be checking daily how you relate with the world, with Mother Nature, with capitalism every day, right? We're part of the machine too, but with patriarchism too, because we have more power maybe to start to change that right now in a daily basis. A very basic thing that we used to say since the 90s, I also was private is public, right? And you cannot understand it other ways.
I wanted to add one more thing on that, just to kind of piggyback. I also meant to bring up the struggles for reproductive rights, as well as the struggles for the LGBTQ community. There are some bills that are trying to get passed in schools to prevent transgender people from participating in sports as the gender that they identify with. And I think that is also part of fighting the patriarchy, because it's the ways it's showing up here in this country. So I think that it's important that we pay attention to these bills that are passing and things that are being taken away from us and stripped away from us, like our basic rights that we deserve.
Can we give another round of applause for this? I have a lot of passion for this subject here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joseph Bierlein. I'm an organizer with the Young Communist League in Detroit. And I see this sometimes in our own spaces, and I have a question about how to address it in our spaces. How do we address the claim that Russia, China are imperialist powers? What significance does this claim have within our movement? How we address is I remember when we first had the discussion for the U.S., we had a discussion before we had a rally regarding the U.S.'s involvement in the war in Ukraine, and there was some sort of political discussion about what sort of asks can we make of our country and of other countries. So how do we address this question that Russia and China are imperialist powers? What does it mean in our spaces? Thank you. Oh, and I wanted to thank everyone, the panelists for being here, and all the attendees being here, and the Michigan Peace Council for hosting this. This has been a really wonderful series.
You know, it's a very important question, because there are a lot of leftists who will say they're opposed to what the U.S. position in involvement in the Ukraine conflict, but who denounce Russia equally as imperialist. And many of those same leftists call China imperialist. You'll see it on groups like Left Voice, that they call China imperialist. It's a very dangerous position when U.S. imperialism is targeting China right now. I mean, imperialism, as we define, is a product of the development, the highest stage of capitalism, of monopoly capitalism. But it's also a world system. You don't see Russia with troops all over the globe like the United States does. It's the United States that staged 251 military invasions since 1991. It's not Russia. Russia has lent solidarity to Syria when it was asked to do so, but you don't see Russian troops all over the world. You don't see Chinese troops all over the world. China trades with countries based on mutual respect and development. And its Belt and Road Initiative has allowed China to develop relations with oppressors. Now the U.S. would like to call that imperialism. But that's not imperialism, that's what mutual relations. But when China doesn't come in, you don't see the setup of China corporations all over the place. You don't see Chinese troops all over the place. It's not imperialism. And I think that's what we have to address. There's a fundamental difference. Russia may be capitalist, and we do view Russia is capitalist under Putin. But that doesn't mean they're an imperialist country, because they're not the ones who are sending their troops all over the world and dominating the entire world, which is what imperialism is. It's a system of domination. It's not just capitalism, it's capitalism at its highest stage based on exploitation and domination of oppressed people worldwide. In fact, the enmity with Russia now is for the opposite reasons. It's because Russia and China have lent solidarity. And that's why I look at the votes in the UN. Under the tremendous pressure of U.S. imperialism, most of the African nations have abstained from condemning the relation. China has abstained from condemning it. Most oppressed nations worldwide have not joined the U.S. condemnation. Who's the U.S. support for its actions in Ukraine? Who's joined it? It's all its European capitalist allies, who are imperialist countries, or junior imperialists in themselves. And I think that's an important statement to make, and that's what's going on right now. Look at where the lines have been drawn. And it's not saying they've all come out, supporting the Russia's intervention. They sure ain't condemning it, because they see Russia at least an alternative. It's U.S. imperialism that's held back the development of oppressed nations worldwide since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's made it impossible to develop without subordinating your economy to U.S. imperialism. Because when the U.S. imperialists go into a country, they don't trade with a country unless you put a McDonald's in, unless you put a GM in, unless their corporate names are all over, unless you subordinate your economy to the interests of imperialism. That's not what the trade fundamentally between Russia and China and the oppressed people is right now, and that's what's really at the root of this conflict, that the U.S. wants to get rid of that obstacle to their domination. And that's why I think it's a very important question you raised, and we got to take the time to analyze it, and we got to win over those who take that position, because if you're weak on that position, then you waffle on the conflict. You waffle on it. And you can't waffle when you're fighting imperialism. I remember going to strike, if a union's on a strike, that's not the time to, we support the strike, but we're against this, that. No, it's the time to support the workers, and then after the strike, we can debate the changes that are needed. But in the midst of a battle, we got to know what side we're on. And we know, we do not equate Russia, we do not equate China with U.S. imperialism. That's clear.
Sammie, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I do. So So I do think that definitely is an important question, and I think that to kind of piggyback off of Jerry, it's important to really address that and think about why are we pointing fingers at Russia and China and not the US? I think that we need to refocus and recenter people on the US imperialism and the ways that affects everything and everyone. I think that we also need to address the ways that we have been spoon-fed propaganda since some of us were in diapers. I know that growing up and going to school in the public school system, that there was propaganda and misinformation there. Constantly trying to tell us that communism is bad, socialism is bad, China's bad, Russia's bad, and that was something that started for us at a very young age. So I think that it's also really important that when people do bring these things up, that we question, well, where did you learn that? Where's your source? And why are we not talking about the US and their imperialism?
Thank you, Sammie. If we can give a round of applause to all of our panelists here. Do you have a quick comment? Okay, because we're a little past 4.
Yeah, in discussing patriarchy and sexism, it just made me think that I'm a 48-year-old man, if I lived in the wrong part of Ukraine, I'd be forced to join the army or not allowed to leave. So the patriarchy is not always good for men either.
Thank you for that comment. Thank you so much. So, we're a little past 4, and it seems like everyone was enjoying the juicy comments and information. So thank you again for being here.
Just announce the actions for next week?
Yes, we're going to...
Oh, I apologize.
Bill's going to announce all of the actions for next week. And there's one thing that David wants to say. Go ahead.
Our good friend Sahar was not able to come today, and we really didn't spend much time, if any at all, talking about Palestine and solidarity with Palestine and opposition to the Zionist state, sometimes called Israel. But it's critical, and trust me, 40, 50 years ago, most people didn't understand it. I remember we were thrown out of a Vietnam coalition meeting right here in Detroit, about 6 groups, because some of us wanted to raise Palestine along with Vietnam. Literally shown the door. So we shouldn't take that for granted. And it's still an ongoing struggle.
Thank you. So before we leave, I just want to say thank you everyone for staying and thank you for coming. This is our 3rd Unite Against Imperialism. And we weren't sure how it would take off, but we're definitely glad that we've been doing it. And we're going to talk more about how we're going to move forward in uniting against imperialism. So if you're not in contact with one another through email, through any social medias, through numbers, make sure that you leave with at least one contact. And besides that, there's still refreshments. We're going to go over the announcements, different events that we have coming forward.
Okay, so I just want to thank Linda Rayburn for handling this difficult part of the event. When everybody wants to talk and everyone's got something to say and we're all valuable, we're all important. And I do want to say that you must realize that you're here and you're so important because there's not many of us. We're the ones who have to expand and get this anti-war stuff going again. That's how, if there were 1,000 people here, it wouldn't be as important for us, but each one of you are valuable. You have to do what you can do. And I thank so much the panelists who took time out of their day to be here and share their stuff and all of your questions. I just want to mention that we have flyers around once again.